In this video we're going to talk about arrays, and up to this point, if we wanted to manage information about 10 different cars or 10 different customers, we would have to create a variable for each and every one of those cars or customers. And this obviously isn't a very practical way to manage large groups of data. There has to be a better way, and that way is with an array. An array is like a variable, except it holds multiple values instead of just one. And we used the analogy back several chapters ago, or lessons, whenever we talked about a variable being like a bucket because you could store information in it. And if that's the case, then an array is a bucket that contains lots of smaller buckets. And so you can put information in each one of the smaller buckets, and when you're done, all you got to do is pick up the one big bucket and move it around, and it's much more manageable that way. And that's the same thought with arrays. So let's take a look at arrays in a practical use by creating a new project. We'll call this Lesson 16. And let's create a single button on our form, and then we'll double click it to view the button's click event. And here, let's create a new array. It's actually going to be very similar to a regular variable. In this case, we've created a variable called cars that we've dimensioned as a string. And if I wanted to make this an array of strings so that I could hold multiple cars in here, what I would do right next to the cars is open a parenthesis and then type in a number and then close the parentheses. So in this case, this would actually hold 4 elements. And so you might be asking yourself, how does it hold 4 elements? You've only typed in the number 3 here. And the answer is that you'll have an element of 0 to begin out every one of your arrays. And then in this case, 1, 2, and 3, which gives us a total of 4 elements within our array. So arrays are 0-based. You can choose to ignore any of the elements, including the 0th element of the array, which means you don't have to put anything in those buckets, so to speak. If you do want to populate any element of the array, you basically reference it like so. Cars, open parenthesis, then the element that you want to use, 0, and then close parenthesis, equal Oldsmobile. Let's do another one. Nissan. Toyota. And let's say Geo. And so now I've populated each of the elements of my array with a value. There's also another way to create arrays. I'll just create one called trucks. I'll do an open and close parentheses as string equals to open curly brace. Then we'll put, let's say, Toyota and Chevy, and maybe one more. What pops to mind? Well, I know Nissan makes trucks too. Okay, and so we have a 3 element array. And so now if I wanted to refer, let's say if I wanted to write the trucks out to a message box, I would type in trucks, then open parenthesis, then the number of the element I want to access, and then the close parentheses. Now, which one of these do you suppose would show up whenever we run this application? If you answered Chevy, you would be correct, because Toyota is at the 0 element, 1 and 2. I'm going to go ahead and delete these to make some other points here. What if we wanted to add an additional element to our array? Is it as simple as just saying cars 4 equal to, let's say, Mercedes? Well, let's go ahead and run our application and see what happens. When I click the button, notice that I get an exception additional information index was outside the bounds of the array. So we tried to put a value outside of the boundary of what the array was currently able to hold. And so in order to expand the array, this is where the array's shortcomings start to come in. We'll have to redimension or redim cars 4. So let's just do a little test here. Messagebox.show cars 0 and messagebox show cars 4. Now let's also copy and paste this line of code here so we can see that olds will appear before we do a redimension, but let's see what happens after we do a redimension and try to display the values. We should see 3 message boxes. We'd expect the first one to say olds, and we'd expect the second one to say olds, but it says nothing. What about the third? It says Mercedes. That's probably what we expected. So the question is, why is our first element, cars sub 0, cleared out after the redim statement? And the answer is, whenever you redimension an array, you are essentially deleting all the values that were already in that array. So you have to start over from scratch. Now there is something that you can do to correct that, and that is another keyword called preserve. So if you do a redim preserve cars 4, let's run the application now. 3 message boxes. The first one says olds. The second one was blank last time. What does it say this time? Olds. It preserved the values after, from before the redimension to after the redimensioning of the array, and then finally Mercedes. And when you begin to combine recursion with arrays, you see where arrays are very helpful. I'm going to comment out these message boxes here. And what we'll do is dim counter as integer for counter equals 0 to cars. And in order to determine how many elements are in the cars array, we can use a property called length. And so we will loop through each item in the cars array and display the value of that element in a message box. So messagebox.show cars counter. So the first pass through, counter will be equal to 0. So cars counter of 0, that would give us the value, let's see, of Oldsmobile. The second time through, it would be counter equals 1. So cars counter of 1 would be Nissan, and so on. So if you're managing a large set of data using arrays or one of the other collections that are available in .NET, the array being the simplest of all of those collections, using an array gives you the advantage of iterating through each of the elements of that array. Here we're merely displaying it, but you can modify it, you could save it, you could delete it, you could do whatever you needed to do to that particular piece of information. Let's move on. The next thing that I want to show you is multidimensional arrays. Up to this point, we've only looked at a single dimension array, this being the only dimension, but we can actually have more than one dimension. I'm going to copy and paste a multidimensional array declaration and what I did to populate it, so you don't have to watch me type all this out. So here I've dimmed trucks as an array of strings, and this is a multi-dimensional array. Here's the first dimension and here's the second dimension, and each of the dimensions have 2 elements in them. Now we know that that's actually 3 elements because we're looking at 0, 1, 2 and 0, 1, 2, giving us a total of 9 elements within our multi-dimensional array. In order to reference each element of the array, we would use this syntax. Open parenthesis, the element of the first dimension, comma, the element of the second dimension. So trucks 0, 0 equals Toyota Tundra, and 0, 1 Toyota Sequoia, and so on. Here we're into the second element of the first dimension and the third element of the first dimension. So you can see where this might be useful in order to segregate the data by some type of qualifier. In this case, the qualifier becomes the make and for a specific model. We can also have a three-dimensional array. I pasted in some more code here. Flights. So I've dimmed flights as a string array with 3 dimensions. 3 elements in the first dimension, 4 elements in the second dimension, and 5 elements in the third dimension. This would give us a total of 60 dimensions within our array. So it might be useful in a situation like this where we're defining flight schedules, where you have a city of origination, a city of destination, and then a specific time when that flight will occur. So you could have multiple flight times for any combination of origination and destination. So you can see we have, for example, in this case, 5 different flight times for Chicago to Dallas. You'd have 5 different flight times from Dallas to Chicago, and so on, until we have used up all the elements of our array, which I abbreviated because I didn't feel like typing out all 60. And again, iteration helps us in this regard as well. Let me use the trucks as an example. So we'll dim I as integer, dim j as integer, and these will just be our counter variables. I've just used the letters I and j to represent a counter. Now when we're dealing with multidimensional arrays, we can't use the length property. We'll have to use a different method of an array. So let's do this. For I equals 0 to trucks dot get upper bound, and then we pass in the dimension. We'll use the dimension 0 to represent the first dimension of the array. So this will perform the exact same operation as the length property. However, it'll do it for multidimensional arrays where we can pass in which dimension we want to get the length or the upper bound of. And then we'll do this again for j equals 0 to trucks dot get upper bound. What do you think we'll type in this time? If you answered 1, you'd be correct. This is the second dimension of our truck array. And so here we would do messagebox.show trucks I, comma j. And so this would loop through each and every one of the trucks and display them in a message box. First, it would start off where I equals 0 and j equals 0, to the next one loop where it would be I equals 0 and j equals 1, and then I equals 0 and j equals 2. Then we will kick outside of this for next loop and cause I to increment to 1, and so on until we have run through the for next statements, this for next statement 9 times, this for next statement 3 times, 1 for each of the values of I. This type of arrangement is called a nested for loop. You have an outside for loop, and inside of it, nested inside of it, is an additional for next loop. And for a third dimensional array, we might do this one more time and add another for next loop inside. So let's go over some terminology before we conclude this video. First of all, the number of items inside of our definition for the array are called dimensions. In this case, we have a 2-dimensional array, In this case, we have a one-dimensional array. In this case, we have a three-dimensional array. Each combination of the dimensions will produce a single element. In this case, element 0, 0, 0 has the value of Chicago, Dallas, 5 a.m. The element of trucks 1, 1, the element would equal Nissan Pathfinder, and so on. An index is a specific value inside a dimension. So the index of 2 in the first dimension, or the second dimension rather. So that concludes the video. As always, I encourage you to take a look at the lesson text as well as the extended readings and the definitions, lesson questions, and in this case, in this lesson, we have an exercise as well in order to fully get your hands around how to use arrays and how to get the most out of them. So thank you.